acute and worsening crisis. These are the words that DHS used to describe the events at the US-Mexico border in the summer of 2019. Dubbed the Southern Border Crisis, DHS, CBP, ICE all struggled to handle the mass influx of asylum seekers, many of whom hailed from the Northern Triangle, which most of us know as El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Further complicating the situation was the fact that many within this group were traveling as family units, ranging from the young to the old, or simply as unaccompanied minors. And DHS, we weren't prepared to handle those kind of diverse needs for those demographics. So in total, for fiscal year 2019, CBP encountered approximately 980,000 people at the US-Mexico border that were trying to come basically into the United States or seek asylum. And while those numbers are shocking, they're not what a lot of us remember. What a lot of us remember are images like this one of an overcrowded detention facility, or of children being separated from their parents at the US southern border, or of the increasing direness of the messages we were hearing on the national headlines from DHS saying what an emergency this was turning into. These were the images and these were the headlines that I thought of when I first came to CHDS and entered the classroom. And I thought to myself, what if these mass asylum caravans from Central America are just a foreshadowing of events to come in the future? What if the events of the southern border crisis of 2019 pale in comparison to future mass migration events? And what my research early on showed, and what I think a lot of us have seen throughout our history as Homeland Security professionals, is that we have been unprepared to handle the complex humanitarian and security challenges that accompany mass migration events. So we can look at the Mariel boat lift for an example. We can look at the influx of unaccompanied minors we saw in the past, or we could just look at the most recent southern border crisis. But in the future, research shows that mass population movements are likely to increase. Why? Well, it's because of the effects of climate change. And that's because we can think of climate change, what we call in security studies, as a threat multiplier. What do I mean by that? Well, climate change is going to exacerbate and amplify pre-existing political, economic, social, and most importantly, environmental instabilities within a country. And as a result, human displacement is likely to occur. In fact, by the year 2050, estimates predict that between 25 million to 1 billion people might be displaced by the effects of climate change. Now, many of these people will stay within the confines of their own country, what we call internal migration. They'll never cross the border. But there will be some that will be forced, possibly, or maybe choose to cross borders. And if they do, many of them will not meet the definition of a refugee. And to qualify for asylum, the first thing you have to do, you have to meet that definition of a refugee. So I thought to myself, well, would we be prepared for such events in the future? And perhaps even more importantly, what could we do now to start preparing for mass climate-induced migration to the United States? So when it comes to wicked problems like climate-induced migration, or like Chad was talking about, like with elections, we within the federal government, especially, yes, I count myself, we find ourselves usually stymied by a lack of imagination. We look at the past as an indicator of the future. Or we just focus on one version of the future, and then we build our strategy around that. And we build all our scenario, all of our strategic planning around that. So what I propose instead is using the what if scenario planning methodology developed by the Royal Dutch Shell Company for us to really assess these wicked problems. So the idea is, instead of looking at one version of the future, we look at multiple versions of the future. And as a result, we have a much more robust understanding of what might be coming down the pipeline. And even if it's desirable or undesirable, we still have expanded the scope of what might happen. So as Thomas J. Chermak explains, scenario planning explores a variety of outcomes, a variety of potential answers, and uses them to create awareness and readiness. Now, I don't know about you, but when I sat in the CHCS classroom for, it would have been 18 months when I did my master's program, I kept thinking time and time again, wow, we could really use more awareness and readiness within the Homeland Security enterprise. And this is where I think scenario planning offers all of us, not just me who's talking about climate-induced migration, amazing, amazing opportunities to leverage. So now you might be thinking, okay, Katelin, scenario planning, really? I haven't even heard of it, or if I have heard of it, I don't really understand it. Well, scenario planning is not that complicated. Basically, you look at driving forces and key variables. When you think about driving forces, these things can be social, technological, economic, environmental, or political megatrends. These are things that research is already showing will likely reshape the world as we know it. So let's say artificial intelligence. That's going to change how society works. Environment, obviously climate change, whole purpose of this talk. Social, we could talk about globalization, urbanization. Now, at the same time, we have key variables, and you have to look at your question at hand. So if my question is, how might we prepare to handle climate-induced migration? Then there's obviously two key variables I can think about. Well, how hot is it going to get over the coming years? Is it going to get 1 degree Celsius warmer, 2, 3, oh gosh, 4? Because that's going to really have an impact on how many people are displaced. And at the same time, what kind of disasters are going to occur? Because the type of disaster can really dictate how permanently displaced a person is. So you bring these driving forces, you bring these key variables together, and you create critical uncertainties. And that's how you build your scenarios, or what I like to call stories. So in total, I built a variety of stories, and today I want to tell you just one of them. So I want you to sit back and imagine yourself 30 years from now. Okay, today is September 2nd, 2050. And the way the morning is running so far, it already looks like it's going to be another long day. You're running late to work, and traffic is at a standstill as you try to make your way into downtown Phoenix. So you turn on the news to pass the time, and the oh-so-familiar weather alert comes on. Warning, extreme temperature effect in order. Today's heat index will be 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Lovely, you think to yourself, if I wasn't already running late, now I have to deal with another incredibly hot day. When will this heat wave end? And just like that, the morning marketplace report comes on. The United States is currently experiencing one of its greatest economic declines in record. US GDP is down 8%. And that's attributable to the fact that there are nationwide disasters and emergencies occurring from coast to coast. The agricultural sector has been devastated, especially in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. And to top it off, critical job shortages abound because now 25% of the American population is over the age of 65. But the reporter goes on to explain Asia, specifically China, is having unprecedented growth. And you think to yourself, well, of course they are. They've cornered the market in green energy. They've also they're recruiting the best and brightest from across the world, including Americans. And their technology and innovation is outpacing the rest of the world. Finally, the traffic starts moving again. And just like that, the national news comes on. CBP has already apprehended 2.5 million people trying to enter the United States by both land and sea. And many of these people, they don't meet the definition of an asylee, but that doesn't keep them from coming. And long ago, the United States abandoned regional cooperation in favor of national interests. So now it finds itself alone trying to grapple with this new mass migration event with people coming from Central America, South America, and also the Caribbean islands. Just like that, you finally arrive at work. You get outside and the heat is almost too much to stand. And you think to yourself, maybe it is time. Maybe it really is time to consider moving farther north because frankly, Phoenix is becoming unbearably hot. Today is September 2nd, 2050, and the world stands at 2.6 degrees Celsius warmer than in comparison to pre-industrial levels. There you have it. That is an example of a scenario. And you might be thinking, Katelin, that's fictional. That hasn't happened. You're right, it hasn't. It's completely plausible, though, because those key mega trends and those key variables I discussed earlier, that's how I built this scenario. This isn't a scenario that is imaginary. No, it's a scenario based on future mega trends and key variables. And while many of us, because we are Homeland Security professionals, many of us will look at that and say, oh my gosh, there are so many threats. We need to start preparing now, and we need to immediately look at deterrence. And I would offer another perspective. I would say within that scenario, there are opportunities. But it takes us reframing the way we look at climate-induced migration. What I propose is instead of looking at climate-induced migrants as victims to a warming world, and that's why they're forcing to migrate, we switch it. We look at them as people adapting to a warming world, because when we switch that, we can find opportunity. So within that scenario I just gave, I just explained that I, an American, am migrating within my own country because it's too darn hot in Phoenix and I don't want to work here anymore. That's me adapting to a warming world. The only difference is I didn't cross a border. I just moved to another state maybe. If we reframe the way we look at climate-induced migration as a form of adaptation, there are opportunities. And I would say that there are 4 opportunities that we could take now in terms of preparedness plans. So first, regional cooperation. What if instead of waiting for people to come to the United States, what if we expanded the types of employment temporary worker visas here? And we geared them towards places that are incredibly vulnerable to climate change, i.e. the Caribbean islands. Australia is already doing this. They've created something called the Pacific Labor Scheme. So the idea would be that they would be able to make money, and they'd be able to make money that they could also send home, which would also help build the resiliency of their family remaining behind. And if you have money, that means it's easier to withstand the effects of a hurricane, of rising sea levels. So maybe they don't become victims. Maybe now they can stay at home on their own in their own country. Second, international competitiveness. This is where I was just talking about in this scenario, is that when it comes to the future, we have to consider the fact that the United States might not have its international power that it does now. But if we want to ensure that we maintain our international competitiveness, that means we're going to have to retain the talent we have in the United States, not lose it to other countries like China or India. And we have to be able to attract talent. Well, we could do that by increasing the annual statutory limits on H-1B and H-2B visas. Because frankly, right now, we do not offer enough. And I could go into those details, but that's not for right now. We want to ensure that the Silicon Valley that exists here right now in the United States doesn't decide to move somewhere else because it's more profitable, or they are now the new places where technology and innovation reign. And finally, economic resilience in critical jobs. That number I gave you in this scenario about Americans aging, yes. By the year 2050, it is estimated that 1 out of 4 Americans will be over the age of 65. So that means two things. We're going to have critical job shortages because the workforce is going to be smaller. Also, that means there's less people contributing to the tax base. Well, migrants could fill this, and we could once again gear a program or free movement agreements towards places that are specifically vulnerable to climate change. And as a result, we would have more money on our US tax base that would help us afford the care of an elderly population. And it would also ensure that we can repair and recover from the effects of climate change when disaster strikes. So in total, I know this is a really different way to think about mass migration events. And I'm not proposing that we forgo border security. Deterrence will always be something we have to focus on. What I'm asking instead is that we expand the scope of how we prepare, that we look past always threats and securitization, that we find opportunities that exist. And in that way, we can move climate-induced migration from an uncertain threat to perhaps a critical opportunity. So I look forward to your questions. I saw the chat box pinging a lot, and I hope if nothing else that you take back what I talked today and reconsider your own strategic plans and maybe what threats and opportunities you aren't considering within your own field of Homeland Security. I actually spent a huge amount of time researching this because I thought that might be the easiest solution. Let me give you an example. Okay, so rising sea levels are likely to be really big in Bangladesh. Now, if you change the definition of a refugee, you're making a lot of assumptions about what the countries in that area will qualify as a refugee. And what if they don't agree to how they want to define a refugee? Why do I say this is because I believe, based off of current megatrends, that international negotiation is going to become a lot more difficult, a lot more complicated, because more people are going to have a say on the international stage. Because right now, research is showing that the world is becoming more multipolar, not unipolar, when it comes to international negotiation. So instead of just changing the definition of a refugee, which would require another refugee convention, it would require a lot of negotiation. And I'm not sure if you guys have been following any UN things. We don't agree very much or very often. So if we just keep waiting for the international community to make a decision or to find a solution for us, I think we're going to have to be more reactive than proactive. So my suggestion instead is looking at regional agreements, because regional agreements allow us to really tailor the needs of the people in the countries surrounding us. And we could better help them. And also we can build in our own security through regional cooperation. So the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, this is something that the Department of State runs. We could leverage that in our favor. And now it's regional. And now we have more say in how we want people to come to the United States. And we could build deterrence into that by making sure only good people that have been properly vetted are allowed to come to the United States. I think there's a difference between throwing money at a problem and offering an opportunity. And what I mean by that is I do have to admit that I work in immigration, and I have seen a lot of people that they want to work, and that might be one of the spurring reasons that they come to the United States. There's a lot of reasons why people migrate. So what my proposal is that if you give people the ability to work in the United States, that is more of a hand up than a hand out. Now, second, there's a critical piece here, because I already can feel like some people being like, are you kidding me? Well, remember, when somebody enters the United States illegally, or maybe they claim asylum, we don't have any information about them because they haven't gone through the Department of State to get a visa. The Department of State is something that basically when you go and apply for a visa, you get asked certain questions and you get your fingerprints taken, right? That's kind of a big deal because then we know who this person is. And so what I would say is if you give people the opportunity and they can pass the actual like visa requirements, then we've already got them on our books. So if they break the rules, then we know who to go after. But also it gives them the opportunity to work. And now they're sending money back to people that actually get to use the money in their community. The Northern Triangle has quite a bit of corruption. So when you throw money at people and just say, you go and spend it where you think it's best, I believe in community-based spending, giving the community that actually is the one that's suffering the ability to choose how to spend the money. And I think family members sending money home, which is called remittances, that allows them to better support their own community and really fund things that are not going to get put in some back pocket of a politician. Right. So that would be my counter argument. Good question. Yes, because of course, everything comes down to the law, right, Cynthia? So unfortunately, yes, that is one of the problems, because I do think immigration reform would have to be considered in these statutory limits on visas. So like the H-1B, for example, there's an annual statutory limit of 65,000 visas a year. For H-2Bs, it's 66,000. That is by Congress. We can't change that just because Katelin Wright thinks that it's a good idea. That would have to go through Congress. But something like the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, that would be something we could work on, at least incorporating climate change into that, where we could look at it more as one of the actual things that are focused on in the Caribbean Security Initiative. We could do that without 8 CFR. Free movement agreements, I think you could expand the scope of the US Mexico-Canadian agreement, USMCA and TN visas. Once again, you're gonna have to go through Congress. So now you might be saying, okay, well then what can we do that doesn't require law change? Well, one of the quick and easiest things we could do is we could re-implement climate change into the DHS, into the DHS 6 missions, because in 2013, there was something called the DHS Climate Action Plan, and climate change was implemented into every mission of DHS. And one of the proposals that was made in this plan was that US Coast Guard, ICE, CBP, and USCIS would come together as a working group and assess different scenarios, specifically climate-induced migration from Central America, South America, and the Caribbean islands. That would be a policy change. That would be something that just whoever, once we get, I think, yeah, Director Mayorkas is now finally in. He could do that. That wouldn't actually have to go through Congress. I'm going to actually look and refer to one of our other federal agencies for this. So the Department of Defense has really taken a proactive approach to climate change. I don't know, I didn't know much about this until I started doing research, but recently the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020, the Director of National Intelligence just amended the NSA of the National Security Act of 1947, and they just created a Climate Security Advisory Council. So I guess my argument would be, we don't really have a choice. We need to get on board because the Department of Defense and DNI, they're looking at this seriously. Why aren't we? And why aren't we leveraging the work that they're already doing? Because from my research that I've seen, they're already doing a lot of work. And I feel like we're just behind. And I'm not just talking about climate-induced migration. I'm talking about climate change in general. So yes, there would have to be working groups, and that would really require maybe a shift in perspective on what is important and what are these future threats. I hope COVID at least has made it clear to all of us that when we're not thinking about the future, it's easy to become blindsided, because there were definitely indicators that COVID could happen. Maybe not the COVID that did happen, but there were driving force indicators out there, and CDC who was warning of these things of spillover, but we didn't do anything. I couldn't agree more. I think you and I know firsthand the power of an executive order. Our agency changes our policies with the wind, especially over these last two administrations. I would hope that we could get it through Congress, but I agree that's maybe being a little too idealistic. I think what could help, I don't think an EO is the right way to work this problem, because I can look at DACA as a perfect example, the Dreamers. One president makes it an EO, the next president retracts it, and we just keep going back and forth, back and forth. And there are people whose lives are in the balance. But in this situation, if we talk about climate-induced migration, there are even more people, I think, lives will be in the balance in the future. So I would prefer if we didn't do an EO and we didn't try to go that route. I think it is going to take more people raising their voices from both the security perspective and a humanitarian perspective, because I don't think this is a one side versus another side issue, because it's clear that there are humanitarian and security challenges that all mass migration events pose, and we're still dealing with it today. The immigration courts are incredibly backlogged, and I could go on, but I would say an EO would be an option. I just don't think it's a preferable one. I think they could give us a better perspective on what's actually going on on the ground. Because like you said, yes, they are headquartered in the US and around the globe. I think sometimes we forget why people migrate. So there's this continuum of migration. And why migration is so hard and so difficult to talk about is because people migrate for a lot of different reasons. And often it's multi-causal. So what do I mean by that? Well, you might just tell me if you come and seek asylum that you're trying to escape violence in Guatemala. But you, in that definition of saying I'm escaping violence, there might be a lot of other factors going on. Well, maybe it's because you were a rural farmer and your crops started dying. So you moved to the city, and there are a lot more people in the city. And so violence got worse. And now you got in with the wrong people. You asked for a loan from somebody, and then you got now you're trying to flee gang violence. And that's why you say you're migrating. But really, maybe it's because you couldn't find a job, then you moved, and then you encountered violence because a lot of other people were moving into the city with you. This is actually what they think might have been a contributing factor to the Syrian civil war, was like a multi-year drought. So I think the NGOs could be really helpful to better understanding the conditions that people are actually dealing with, so we can better tailor, if we were to get Congress to pass it, so we could better tailor who needs these types of worker visas and who could possibly qualify for them. Because the other problem with visas right now in the US is a lot of them are tailored to professional work or agriculture. And they just are very, very strict definitions. So like the TN visa that was under NAFTA, which is now the US-Mexico-Canadian agreement, these are professionals only. But what if you're not a professional, but you still need a job? So that's how I think NGOs could help. My one that I think of immediately is the Jordanian Compact. I don't know how many people are familiar with that. This has nothing to do with climate change. The Jordanian Compact is an agreement between Jordan and the EU. Jordan has actually resettled more Syrian refugees than any other country. So the EU, though, has provided money to help the Jordanian government do this. So when I was thinking about this problem, I kind of considered that, like, what if we sent money to Mexico and they were the intermediary country? Just to, once again, just thinking outside of the box. Jordan has had some good results with it. I don't know every single detail, but they have actually resettled a lot. So you could look at the Jordanian Compact, and then Australia's Pacific Labor Scheme. It's still in its infancy. It's not had the best results yet, but its focus is on a secure regional area, because Australia recognizes that the Pacific Islands are part of their regional security. So if something bad happens to Kiribati, then that's going to possibly affect Australia. So they came up with something called the Pacific Labor Scheme that allows people to come and work in Australia to fill critical job shortages. So those are two different ways that other countries have dealt with mass migration. And I think there's more to be learned. Honestly, this topic is, I think I could write and research about it the rest of my life, and I still would miss things. And there are a lot of people that are looking into it now, which I find really encouraging. So this kind of gets back to the free movement agreements. Is we can look at the EU. They've really struggled with COVID and having the free movement agreements that people could just come and go as they please from one country to the next. So that has definitely thrown kind of a wrench in my idea of, well, free movement agreements could be helpful for climate change induced climate induced migrants, because it could turn into a public health issue. I think that's one specific one to my research, is that well, free movement agreements do have a certain degree of issues built within themselves, because we can't secure if people can just come and go across the border and there is a public health issue like COVID. One of the things that we can do, and we have done here, is you can close the borders so you can restrict who comes and goes. Now, outside of climate change induced migration, public health wise and climate change, one of the big things is spillover. This is just research I've done because of megatrends. Is the idea is that we're going more into species environments that we've never actually had contact with as humans, and then the chances of spillover are greater. So I do think that climate change and public health are going to be huge. I think it's a whole other thing to consider. And that's why I keep I know I've said it before and earlier, I really do think DHS truly needs to incorporate climate change into its key areas of mission. And yes, to my thesis advisor who asked me, Chris Bellavita, well, what about the DHS workforce? How does that have anything to do with anything, Katelin? I would say, well, I think that we need to make sure that we can keep recruiting people to work for DHS. And we need the best and brightest too, to look at climate change from a homeland security perspective. So I suppose that would be where I would get back to, even to your question, Beth, is that we need to start thinking about climate change from a DHS perspective, because frankly, I think we're behind the 8 ball in comparison to what DOD is doing. And the fact that the National Security Act was amended and a Climate Security Advisory Council has been created, and we're not looking at this as a homeland security issue, we're behind the 8 ball. We need to get back on top of this, because I can list lots of ways that this could affect all of our agencies within Homeland Security and our key areas of mission. I'm going to first admit that I am not as strong in deterrence, because I don't work for CBP and I don't work for ICE. But with that being said, I have done a lot of public safety work as an immigration officer, and it's one of the things that I think is really, really important, because at the end of the day, as an ISO, we're still the gatekeeper from people being able to get permanent residency or naturalization in the US. So why do I say that in terms of deterrence? Well, I think deterrence still has to play a very important role in securing our borders, because we have to ensure that the right people are being let in. And that's why I like the idea of a proactive approach, where we're actually vetting people before they come in versus them showing up seeking asylum and us having no history on them. So the first thing I would say is that I do think the Climate Security Basin the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative would be an ideal way for us to really run drills and look at deterrence in that way. Also, I would say that we need to reconsider how we can protect the borders in a warming world scenario. Kind of back to that idea of, if it's so hot on the US-Mexico border that like people could die just being outside exposed to the weather, which there is research out there, depending on how warm it gets, that could be something, people could just die of heat stroke. Is it really logical to think that we could put CBP officers on a border like that? So we need to think more creatively, like what could we use with drone technology? I know CBP is doing that. But that would be one thing. But I think that would be where I'd like to see CBP and ICE be part of this discussion. Why I think a working group between US Coast Guard, CBP, ICE, and USCIS could be very advantageous, because sometimes we only see we rarely see each other's work. And when we do, it's not always in the best of circumstances. So it needs to come, we need to think about this problem from multiple perspectives. And I think ICE and CBP need to be a part of that. But I wouldn't even begin to say that this is my area of expertise in terms of how we could do that.